moment, but the moments that stick with me the most were was often the journey that it took from taking a team in June and then seeing what they become by March of the following year, to see what they accomplished was usually were the moments that I remember most. And I think that's what makes a sports story great. I think it's the journey. I think about the 1980 movie Miracle, and when they're you're beating each other up because they're from the rival college teams, right? And then they finally realize they have to work together, and that's the climax of the movie, right? But it's the journey it takes, whether it's a football player picking up the football for the first time, whether it's a figure skater for his first steps on the ice. I love those Olympic segments right now that have them watching their old selves. There was one of the figure skater, Ilya. He was watching a competition from when he was 12 years old, and they watched when they were first going down the hill, the ski slopes. And I think what makes those moments so memorable and so important to me and to so many is that it's all about an athlete finding their full potential. And often, we know, sports are as much a mental game as they are a physical game. If you've ever played a sport, if you've ever maybe had a child who played a sport, if you've ever watched sports, you know it's a mental game as much as it is a physical one. We had skaters who they didn't believe in themselves, and we would have to be you can actually do this. We believe in you. And seeing their potential, their capabilities that they had inside of them, we as coaches felt it was often our job to help them see in themselves what they couldn't yet see. My mom and I were notorious for choosing skaters for our teams who weren't necessarily the best, but were the ones who we saw the potential in. We're you know what, they could be great. And we could mold them. We could make them into the athlete we want them to be. I remember there was one skater of mine, I started teaching her when she was 4 years old. She was a little redhead. And she got on the ice every week, and she cried. But Mom put her out there, and she would cry, and she was silent. She didn't say a word, and we'd just do swizzles around the rink for 20 minutes. Just, okay, go from this cone to that cone, okay. And she wouldn't look, she just, okay. And the tears, big alligator tears. She just competed this week. She now represents Team Canada, but she's just competing at the highest level of synchronized skating now. And I remember her, I'm oh my gosh, she just stood there looking at me with these big tears. A lot of times in our lives, whether it's an athlete, whether it's you growing up as a teenager, as a child, as a young person, we need people who remind ourselves of who we are and the potential that we have inside of us. I think that's why I loved coaching, because it was so much about helping our athletes see the potential that they had and what they were capable of when they couldn't yet see it themselves. But so often in our lives, even now, we need reminders of who we are. We need reminders of our potential, of our full capacity. That's why God puts in our lives friends, mentors, coaches, spouses, therapists, and others who help us see what's inside of us when we can't see it ourselves. And today's scripture reminded me that Jesus is another one who shows us our potential when we don't necessarily see it ourselves. So, we're in Matthew 5. If you were here last week, Martel preached about the Beatitudes. I'm going to just kind of center ourselves, and then we'll get into the text. We're in Matthew 5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So he's preaching this message mostly to his disciples, but there's tons of people gathered and listening as well. And so the Beatitudes express truths about God's reign. Some might call this the kingdom of reversals, right? Matthew's Beatitudes talk about those who are blessed are the poor in spirit. the mourners, the meek, the people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted. The Sermon on the Mount teaches how life under the reign of God often looks different than we think it looks. It results in transformation that is characterized by humility, that's characterized by peace, by purity, by welcome for those who are oppressed and marginalized. It looks different than we think it looks. Jesus says, blessed are all these people who have never been considered blessed before. So it's a moment of first teaching. Jesus is teaching. Blessed are those, blessed are those, blessed are those. And then later in the Sermon on the Mount, which goes on for a while, he demands action. He demands people to take that information and make it action. And this little scripture in the middle of Matthew 5, verse 13, is actually the transitional moment between those two places. We have the Beatitudes, the teaching, and then it's kind of like this little interlude, and then Jesus gets into this whole other section about ethics. Really long. You can read it later. And Jesus takes a moment between these two places to tell the people who they are. And what does he call them? The salt of the earth and the light of the world. So let's talk about salt. I love salt. I probably use too much salt. No, I don't use too much salt. But salt is a source of flavor. In the ancient world, it was a preservative, and we know it as something that alters and enhances the taste of food. Salt can make come alive what would otherwise seem tasteless and bland. Some ancients believed salt could ward off spirits. It was often a symbol of religious covenant. Covenants were sealed with salt. And it has countless numbers of meanings other than those. But in ancient times, did you know that salt actually isn't the same chemically? It wasn't the same chemically then as it is now. I just learned this. Ooh. It contained many other minerals, and therefore, if the salt content got low or dissipated completely, it wasn't considered salt, which is why Jesus is like, hey, salt can lose its saltiness. That's why. Because it had all this other stuff in it, and then if the salt went away, well, it's not salt anymore, which is why Jesus